Brings me to this artist, May Stevens, whose work actually sparked my own kind of foray into this topic of painting as a form of protest. I had known about Stevens's iconic series, Big Daddy, through my research on the history of art and activism, but I hadn't delved into it until I was doing research on examples of protest art at my institution's museum, which is the Mayer Museum of Art at Randolph College, which has one of Stevens's prints, the one on the right, called Big Daddy Paper Doll from 1970. Like Picasso, Stevens was inspired by contemporary events, namely the American War in Vietnam, to create Big Daddy, but she also had her father in mind and Theodore Roosevelt as sources for this caricature of patriarchal authority. Big Daddy is a nude, fleshy, white middle-aged man with an absurdly phallic or bullet-shaped head and a bulldog in his lap. Her most famous depictions are like the one on the right, showing him as a paper doll, surrounded by uniforms for the military, police, a butcher, an executioner. Stevens's critique of authoritarianism in the guise of a middle-aged white man was not just about patriarchy or even just an anti-war statement, but it also exposes what James Baldwin called the lie of whiteness. The idea of Stevens's series as a direct critique of whiteness still needs to be fleshed out, I think, in the literature, and I hope to fill that gap with some of my research. As I was doing more research into Stevens and this idea of whiteness in painting, I came across this fantastic artist, Vivian Browne, who is a Black American artist and close friend of Stevens's became friends with Stevens in the early 70s. And I discovered this series by her called Little Men. Browne began the series while she was living in New York in the mid 1960s, around the same time that Stevens was working on her Big Daddy series, although they hadn't yet met as artists. The series, Browne's series, Little Men, consists of over 200 works on paper and paintings on canvas, all centered on one or more male figures in various absurd actions with grotesque faces and bodies, painted in a loose, expressionistic style. In an interview from 1968, Browne described how, after a brief period in which she found she could no longer paint, she began to explore more personal content that could speak to her experience of being a Black woman in a patriarchal society. Browne made this work out of her frustration and rage over her experiences of racism and sexism in both her personal and professional life.